welcome to our panel on climate innovation and the clean energy tech boom. I'm Hayes Ferguson, director of the Farley Center. I'm excited to introduce our moderator and panelists who will be discussing the state of climate innovation and the most promising areas of climate tech. Our moderator is Vijay Vaitheeswaran, Farley's Distinguished Visiting Fellow. Vijay is the Global Energy and Climate Innovation Editor at The Economist. He's used his background as an MIT-trained engineer to write on a wide range of topics over the past 3 decades. And though he was trained at MIT, he is all Northwestern these days, and hence the purple jacket. So thanks for wearing the right color, Vijay. Welcome, Vijay. Our first panelist that I'd like to introduce is Gary Cooper, who, speaking of Northwestern, graduated with a PhD in neuroscience from the university in 2014, and he has been busy ever since. I'm sure he was busy then, but he's currently CEO and co-founder of Reaply, a startup that helps organizations better visualize, quantify, and manage their physical assets. He's also a general partner at Long Jump Venture Fund and serves on the boards of 1871 and P33 in Chicago, doing a lot for our local ecosystem. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you.
Next, we have Bill Gross. Bill is founder and CEO at Heliogen, a clean energy company focused on eliminating the need for fossil fuels in all sectors of the economy. He's also founder and chair at Idea Lab, a technology incubator that has started more than 150 companies and created more than 10,000 jobs in the past 24 years. Welcome, Bill, who has obviously been busy as well.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Thanks. Dawn Lippert is CEO and founder at Elemental Accelerator, a global climate technology investor and nonprofit impact organization. She also serves as founding partner of Earthshot Ventures, a $60 million venture fund that spun out of Elemental in 2021. She serves as the director of innovation and community at Emerson Collective, which is the investment and philanthropic arm, a platform led by Laureen Powell-Jobs. Welcome, Dawn.
Thanks so much for having me.
And last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce you to Abe Yokel. Abe is the co-founder and managing partner at Congruent Ventures, which partners with entrepreneurs to build companies addressing sustainability challenges. He has more than 15 years of investment experience, serves on a wide range of boards dedicated to energy and sustainability, and launched Rockport Capital's West Coast office in 2007. And welcome, and coming to us from the West Coast, Abe.
Thanks for having me.
A little bit of housekeeping before I turn the mic over to Vijay. We will be taking questions from the audience starting at 4:45 p.m. Central Time. Having said that, you should feel free to submit questions throughout the discussion in the Q&A section of your screen, and we'll queue them up and get them distributed to the right folks. And with that, I'd like to turn the mic over to Vijay, who will begin today's conversation. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Hayes, and welcome everyone. And thank you to my panelists for joining us. This is a real all-star cast, so I'm really excited. You know, climate tech, as it's called now, used to be called clean tech back in the day, before I had gray hair. When Bill and I used to go and visit Bill in Pasadena to talk about the future of clean energy ages ago, and he had a glint in his eye. He saw it coming, but there were a lot of doubters. And the clean tech boom that Abe was also involved with, it had its difficulties, it must be said, right? Tech boom turned to bust maybe 12 years ago. Talent scattered, money scattered, entrepreneurs scattered, and it seemed like it was a desert. But here we are. Climate tech is the new branded version of this, and modified, to be fair. It's a slightly different approach. Maybe more ambition is involved this time, more money, more talent. We're going to hear all about that. But climate tech attracted some $85 billion in the year to June 2021 from venture capital and private equity, that is new sources of capital, a 200% increase on the previous 12 months to that period. On one estimate, 15% of all global venture capital now goes into this once shunned sector. And vitally, scale-up capital is now available of the sort that brave pioneers that used to go in with early money, finding it difficult to scale up, get their first pilot project done, to find an exit. Today, the market is awash in capital from dedicated climate funds, from corporate innovation funds at Microsoft and Amazon and other places that are looking for these sorts of deals to scale up, and other innovations and developments in the marketplace we'll talk about. In other words, it's not a problem of money anymore. But what about the other factors? Policy was difficult. Talent, you couldn't always attract to this very somewhat nerdy corner of innovation compared to the internet, let's say. And the IP question, patents. There are numerous challenges along the way that have bedeviled this sector. It's hard engineering sometimes. It's a lot easier to put out an app with two guys in the garage that can turn a profit shortly than trying to work on a very difficult climate-related problem. So how did this happen, and what are the prospects? To help us think through this, I'm going to ask our gurus who have joined us, who are both experts but also practitioners. They're putting their money where their mouth is. They're mobilizing communities. They're getting companies into the marketplace. So I'm going to turn to you, Bill, first. First of all, welcome. Thank you for joining us. You have such a phenomenal wealth of experience and number of companies you've worked with. Give us your sort of short take on where we've come from. What happened last time, and maybe what lessons should we learn to make sure that the current investment in this area is successful and long-lived?
Well, I think things have completely changed, and for the better. The early climate tech efforts, I think, failed because they were too early. The timing wasn't right. The world wasn't ready. The technology wasn't ready. We were at an unrealistic position on the learning curve, and we've advanced down that learning curve quite a bit. There wasn't enough demand. The governments were starting to be interested back then. I say back then, a decade ago, but the corporations were not interested yet. And fossil fuels got all the subsidies, but clean tech didn't. And we're still fighting to get our fair share of them, but fossil fuels really, really won out that. So I'd say, what did we learn back then? Well, it would be great to be able to compete on a level playing field. We definitely need to compete on economics. Definitely profit matters. We need to plan for scaling and getting down the learning curve and really make sure that we plan for that in all of our models. We need to plan and take into account volatility in the fossil fuel markets. Of course, even just today, like literally today with Putin and the fossil fuel volatility that's going on in the world, we need to have patience. And I think most of all, what I learned from the prior efforts that didn't work, and maybe now what is working, is understanding the 3 stages of truth. There's this really great Schopenhauer quote. We love it so much, we have it on the wall in our building. All truth passes through 3 stages. First, it's ridiculed. Second, it's violently opposed. Third, it's accepted as being self-evident. Well, 10 years ago, we were in the ridiculed phase. We thought we should be accepted, but we were delusional. We thought we were ready but we were still being ridiculed. 5 years ago, we started getting opposed. People started feeling threatened because clean tech was really making a positive impact, and the incumbents were starting to feel nervous. And we're pushing our way right now into it becoming self-evident. I mean, I feel the transition's happening right now, like this decade. Actually, 2020, COVID, all those things have been a firing shot in everybody understanding how big a problem this is. So when we finally get to fully self-evident, that means we've changed the world. That means we've shifted the economy and everybody. And I feel we're very close. So I feel we're just on a good path to do that right now.
That's great. So a big part of the change, you mentioned timing, of course, but also mindset. The world may be more ready for the kind of things that you're advocating. And if you were just to reflect on this a little bit, you talked about being along the learning curve. How much do you think that extra decade of time from the clean tech to now the climate tech boom made in terms of the actual technologies involved?
Oh, absolutely huge. Solar and wind had a learning curve of improving by about 20% in cost for every doubling of cumulative installed base. Solar was even more than 20%. That means that as it got installed over the last decade, we reached a turning point in all of history in 2018, when you could make electricity from solar and wind cheaper than any other electrons in all of human history. Now, of course, we still have intermittency challenges and we have to have storage and other things, but the power produced by those things, because of the learning curve, is the cheapest in all of humankind. So that is huge. Like, that is a change to civilization that we need to harness properly in this coming decade.
Great, thank you. Dawn, let me come to you. First, just a sense of the journey, where you've come. You have a novel, path-breaking approach that you've taken in your base in Hawaii to creating an ecosystem and connecting with a community. Can you tell me how you got to where you are, and maybe what lessons you might have taken from other experiences and some of the things that Bill has mentioned?
Sure, and we've been really privileged to be on the journey with Bill for many of these years too. We actually first started working with Heliogen I think about 7, 8 years ago. So, many of us have been on the journey together for a long time, and Abe as well. So I will say that, Elemental is a nonprofit, as you mentioned, nonprofit model. We've tried lots of different things. We think of it as a platform for trying to solve some of the trickiest issues in climate innovation. And I came to this originally from working in Washington, D.C., working at ARPA-E and some of the really breakthrough technologies that were started around 2009, 2010, really the beginning of this kind of boom. And seeing that while those technologies were really interesting and there were some phenomenal sort of technical breakthroughs coming through, they were also in many cases being developed without the context of the communities where they would eventually be deployed. And at the same time that I was working on sort of that initial launch of ARPA-E and some of those really big technologies, ARPA-E is like DARPA for alternative energy technologies, for folks who aren't familiar. And while we were working on some of those breakthrough things in Washington, D.C., I was also working on these issues in Hawaii on the ground, trying to actually transition an entire economy from fossil fuels to clean energy. And we really started seeing the disconnect between some of the things that are being funded nationally and actually what communities are asking for and what they need. And so started Elemental to fund those demonstration projects, fund first of a kind projects for new technologies in collaboration with community. And so we funded 135 companies now to date through the Elemental model. We have a really vast portfolio across transportation, energy, et cetera. And what we've learned is that companies are actually much stronger when they design with the community in mind from the beginning, but it's really hard. And I can give you some examples of where we've succeeded, where we haven't, what we've learned. But really, I think that in order to get to scale on these climate technologies, we actually need entrepreneurs who are working really closely with communities where they're deploying. And the reason why this is so different in climate than it is in other technology is that climate technologies, like Bill's talking about solar and wind, and many of these technologies are actually going into people's neighborhoods and homes and cities in a way that's totally different from internet technologies, which even though we interact with them in our homes, it's really different from seeing something built next door to you. And there might be some opposition, there might be unintended consequences, complexity there. So that's what we've learned in our years of working on this. And we've had the amazing experience of partnering with some great companies. The one thing I will add to what Bill said is that in addition to a lot of the learning curve and the failures that we had in sort of the 1.0 clean tech era, there are also huge successes. And I think people really need to remember that and think about it. So we had companies like Tesla, Nest, O-Power come out of that. Also companies that we've invested in like Proterra and STEM, who are now in the public markets, Heliogen, who's now in the public market. So there's also a lot of successes that have been growing from that time. And I think that we can also learn from those successes as well as some of the failures of the time.
That's great. Don, of course, your point is well noted that numerous successes have come, even from clean tech 1.0, as it were. And if you take the venture capital mindset of, you need 1 or 2 Googles to come out and 98 can lose, then the early investors that came into this area, I know Bill is one of them, but you could talk about the Vinod Khoslas or the John Doerrs. They've certainly more than made back, and Abe more than made back on those losses. But just because I wanted to start with a bit of reflection on where we come, I'm going to ask you for either a big failure or a big challenge that you overcame with your approach that taught you about what you need to do today. Can you give us that one small case study or a little example of a challenge overcome or a failure?
Yeah, I mean, we've had a number of companies and examples here in this space. I think one example would be sort of a failure to launch companies. So we fund first of a kind pilots for companies. And sometimes the idea is to design them so they can scale 10x within 2 to 3 years. And sometimes the pilot itself doesn't even really get off the ground or succeed. I would say, one example is where we tried to do a residential energy efficiency technology and really didn't have sufficient community buy-in or outreach partners on the ground to do that. We learned a lot from that process. One of the things that we learned is that it's incredibly important to recruit in terms of like salespeople and outreach people from the zip codes and the actual neighborhoods where you want to deploy, especially if it's something that seems like it might be too good to be true. So we learned that lesson with some of the early energy efficiency technology we were trying to deploy. And when we later worked with Ohm Connect, one of the companies in our portfolio to do this, that's exactly what we did. We actually brought in people with OhmConnect from those neighborhoods where they were trying to deploy this. OhmConnect is a company that pays you to save electricity. So people thought it was a scam. People thought it was fake, and thought it was too good to be true. So it really requires those trusted partners who are not brand new faces in a community coming in, especially in disadvantaged communities and the communities who especially need this kind of technology. And so that's something that we learned the hard way working in energy efficiency and working in community.
Thank you. Gary, can you tell us a little bit about how you got to your business model? You're not a climate tech guy by background. You have a deep medical neuroscience background, and yet here you are doing cutting edge work with your company in the circular economy. So give us a sense of what attracted you to this, and again, in a sense of the journey that brought you there, maybe a lesson learned along the way.
Yeah, and I'm just super excited to be here with some of my heroes. So yeah, I'm a neuroscientist, I'm a geek. I wasn't thinking about sustainability 10, 12 years ago. I was trying to find a cure for Parkinson's disease, in fact, at Northwestern University. And what I noticed was that we were just wasting a lot of the material that we had purchased in our own laboratories. Scientists tend to be people who are outwardly green, outwardly sustainable, but we weren't doing it in practice in the actual work that we were doing. And so I started a program at Northwestern, a resource sharing program, where if we didn't need things in our lab, we could share them with other labs. And it turns out people like that program. I left Northwestern and went into consulting, and I would still get emails from people at Northwestern like, hey, where's the cart? Where's this program? I'm like, oh, interesting. So about 6.5 years ago, we built a technology product that helps large organizations with reuse and kind of helping them operationalize circularity. As I think about my journey kind of being, abnormal to what you might expect a CEO of a climate tech company, I actually don't see that. A lot of the people who are entering being circular economists, being chief sustainability officers, actually come from financial backgrounds, and come from legal backgrounds, and they come from educational backgrounds. What I see is a lot of people just saying, hey, can't there be a better way? Can't my children live in a greener, cleaner planet? And if I can lend my time, working life, to making that so, why not do so? And so we have a lot of people in our company who were designing things for video games and are now building climate tech technology for a lot of the biggest organizations. And just one little comment around kind of the phase change, at least for me, and I think a lot of the folks in my peer group, the IPCC said code red. In 2020, the skies were orange in the West Coast for a good long time. Just a couple of months ago, there were catastrophic storms in the Midwest and Kentucky. So I think one of the things that's changed for me is, and I think others, is how real the crisis is and how dare people who can not to do something about it.
You're a great example of the kind of talent that this sector is drawing in that a decade ago or 15 years ago might have gone in. Indeed, did go into a different field, right? So in a sense, it's bright. It's a brighter future thanks to you joining it. Can you talk just a little bit about what you'd like to see in talent? I know you work on the ecosystem in Chicago.
Yes.
And work towards more diversity in that ecosystem. Can you tell us some of the things that you're finding and some challenges you'd like to have overcome?
Yeah, so my personal ethos in my working career is to make it more diverse and more sustainable. So I think about those two vectors when I think about the answer to your question. So the first thing I do, and I take no money for this, is I spend a lot of time giving lectures in business schools, because I think anyone coming out with an MBA and is going to lead something in an organization needs to understand the words circularity. It needs to understand ESG and all these kind of new age terms and what they mean, and not get it when they're in the business, but be thinking about it in their business training. So that's the kind of sustainability side. On the other side, with diversity, I think it would be an absolute shame if we don't usher in a low carbon circular economy being different than the one that we currently operate in. And I mean that in saying that the communities of color typically are the ones most affected by the scenarios we all know and read about from a climate perspective. So I think the ones of us who can should make sure they're part of the solution, and that this new economy bursts itself into new economic opportunities for the people who are in those communities. So it's a personal passion of mine not to just bring Reaply to a good place, but along the way, get people who are in business excited about sustainability, and get people in neighborhoods of where I grew up from, starting companies and working in tech and climate tech.
That's great. Thank you. Abe, you talk about a great climate confluence. Can you tell us what that means, and maybe just give us a shorthand on what does climate tech or clean energy tech mean for you today? There's a question from the audience that wants us to clarify exactly, because these are kind of slippery terms. If it's sort of cuddly and green, does it fit in this bucket, or would you have a more precise definition of what it is?
I think if you ask the four of us, we'll probably have different definitions, but just for kind of miles traveled, just like many of my cohort here, I've been doing this now for 18 years, and Congruent's about 5 years old. So we're doing very similar to Don in many ways, is that first stage of kind of capital formation, but using the venture model. What we define as climate tech and sustainability for us is any company or solution that has a positive impact at scale on energy, climate, or sustainability. That is intentionally very broad and vague for us. And our view on that is the entire economy and world needs to decarbonize. It touches everything we do, the way we move, the way we eat, the way we consume. It's everything. It's circularity, it's energy, it's how we move things. Every part of our economy needs to change in order to address some of these climate challenges. When we do have we have 4 verticals I won't bore you with, but one of those we call the energy transition, which is really around clean energy broadly. And that's everything about how you produce the clean electron, or the clean fuel source, I should say, to how you manage it, to how you actually deal with some of the issues that Bill was referring to around intermittency. Sun shines sometimes, not all the time, as it turns out, and wind blows some of the time, not all the time. I do have a little thing I trot out sometimes when the question comes up around what is different this time. You can spend 2 hours talking about what happened last time. I think a lot of these themes have already been touched on, so I won't belabor them. But one of the big pieces is around that emotional undertone in the last couple of years. Markets are just the outcome of emotional inputs, supposedly rational, not so much. When you see all this capital being deployed into climate tech, whether it's late stage, early stage, when you see the talent moving into the ecosystem, I've never seen a talent flow like this, 18 years deep. It is because of the issues that have been mentioned here. One of the things that went dramatically wrong in that kind of first blow up was the financial returns measured by a typical fund cycle, which is about 10 to 12 years. Absolute disaster. Some of the solutions that were actually invested in and have now scaled, very successful. We would not be where we are today without those dollars that had been lost. Incredibly successful, actually. It's been mentioned the marginal electron is now cheaper if it is renewable versus fossils. That is, Bill hit this, it's rewriting the entire ecosystem in energy. It's going to take a long time. The energy industry is massive. It takes a long time to make a dent, but every marginal electron, for the most part, at least in the developed world, is coming on as renewables. That's one of the big undertones too. That has made it easier. This is another one of the points. Renewables are cheaper than fossils. That covers everything, and that is different now than it was 10 years ago. A couple other pieces are also tech related, which are around deploying tech solutions to address some of our challenges. 10, 12 years ago, the venture industry was this very closed world. I'm not claiming it's open now, but if you're a student, you can actually understand what's going on. You can understand how to, bake a pitch. You can understand what venture funds are looking for. And there's been a specialization in the capital stack. I used to do stage agnostic investing. Now I do early stage. And there's a whole cohort that does kind of the next stage, and another group that does the next stage. And there's project finance that understands these markets. That's completely new. And one last point is, I would say the interest rate environment over the last 10 years, well, there's not a lot of ink spilled on this, has been an absolute boon, has accelerated the entire transition. I think we're at the point where we can handle some inflation these days, which is good because we're seeing it. But that has been a massively helpful input. So you have all these various items that have come together to create this amazingly happy place for climate tech to exist. In the last 2 years, I, as well as many of our others, I hate to say this, friends, but we've not been the cool kids at the party. It's the weirdos in the corner that are talking about the climate stuff. And in the last couple of years, it has changed dramatically. It is both wonderful and also head spinning at times.
I'm glad to know I'm hanging out with the cool kids now. I was hanging out with you guys when you weren't cool. So you make an interesting point about interest rates. And I wonder, Abe, some people have argued that the long and prolonged period of low interest rates was the effect of another sort of quantitative easing amount of boon to capital intensive industries, right? Particularly. And we know one of the differences between renewables is it's CapEx intensive, that is a lot of upfront cost, but the fuel is practically free over the low volatility, low price. And that affects the return profile. It affects the kind of investor profile you have. And if we are indeed, and it looks very likely, shifting to a higher interest rate environment for some period of time, at the same time that all of the net zero plans, that is the energy transition plans, argue for a dramatic shift towards renewables, but also dramatic increase in spending on energy tech. If you get to a very CapEx intensive model, as for example, Europe is pursuing in an era of high interest rates, what do you think it does to that investor appetite, the attractiveness? Do we need to innovate that too, or will it perhaps prove the end of the golden age?
I don't think it's the end of the golden age. I think the horse is out of the barn. Most of these solutions are now to the point where they're actually so dramatically cheaper, they can actually handle some inflationary environment. You're absolutely right on CapEx versus OpEx. But there are costs of capital behind other forms, alternative forms of energy as well. And you're kind of kicking the can in those scenarios, but in general, it's a less volatile electron or source of energy, and it is generally cheaper even when you factor in high interest rates. If we get into a massively inflationary environment, much more so than we're seeing today, I'll reserve the right to change that comment, but I think a bit of inflation, probably not the worst thing.
Great, thank you. Let me move into our current phase of where we are with climate tech, and maybe even look a little bit to the future. I'm going to give my panelists a chance to sort of, come to blows if they want, if they have different points of view, and let me know if you want to jump in on a point. But let's take up the point that Abe made about, this perhaps being an era in which even a bit of inflation and higher interest rates, which is really the challenge, may not harm or undermine clean tech. Bill, let me ask you, if we're at the declining era of a golden age, I would argue, with low interest rates, and more than that, also the age of the SPAC, right? There's been access to novel kinds of financing vehicles. And if I'm not mistaken, you're going for a SPAC trifecta with some of the companies you're involved in. Tell us in very short order, how did the SPAC phenomena affect clean tech particularly? Because it was over-indexed on clean tech companies. And what do you see coming in terms of financing in the current age?
First, I'm going to agree.
Bill, you've lost your audio, I think. We'll give him a moment. And we think we can colonize Mars. We can't even get a Zoom call going here, right?
How about now?
There we go. You're good, Bill. You're good.
Am I back?
Yes.
You're good.
Oh, now I can't hear you. I'm really sorry.
You're fine. Let's see if we can get him to continue, because I think we can hear him. Thumbs up, guys, if you can hear Bill. Okay, yeah, we can hear you, Bill. I'll send him a note saying, please speak. Okay, I hope he'll get this. If not, I'll turn to one of you who wants to jump in.
You hear me now?
Bill, you're good. Yes, you're good. Go ahead.
I can't hear you. Say something, Vijay.
You're good, Bill. We can hear you. Please continue.
Better go on to the next person. Be right back.
Okay. All right. Fine. That's fine. Does someone else want to jump in on, if it's not financing, what do you see as a potential challenge now that we're into a very full-throated, enthusiastic societal support, policy support, and sort of next round of climate tech? What kind of headwind could we expect, or what's the next challenge we need to overcome?
I can jump in.
Sure.
So from our perspective, one, I would push back on the policy. I don't know if we're there from a policy perspective. So I have many things to say about where we could be in the United States, especially at the state and local level, around climate-friendly, eco-friendly policy. But that not being the case, I think inertia, right? We just are still kind of quarantining. We're definitely still in some type of pandemic. And I think it's people are busy and people are distracted and there's a lot happening. There's a lot of change happening at the same time. And so I think just the ability, the brute force to change is something that we are always thinking about in the companies that we work with. Like, how do you operationalize these programs? How do you get people to change their behaviors without seeing the sky being orange again and without, many more code reds? So beyond kind of the financial pressures in the financial markets and what the governments can do from a regulatory policy perspective, I think it's us and the communities and the companies that we work in. How do we get out of our own way and actually start to pilot and accept next new technologies and changes, even though we are busy and distracted by other important things like public health?
Just to press on that a moment. Oh, Bill, you're back.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
Excellent.
But go ahead,
let's come to you. Let's get your thoughts, Bill. You're going to agree and then disagree, perhaps, is what I understood.
I'm really sorry about that. I'm going to fully agree with Abe that even with 7.5% inflation, natural gas has had 400% inflation in the last year. That makes renewables even more competitive. I don't think we could remotely have inflation that's keeping up with the price of the doubling of oil in the last 6 months or the price of natural gas going up. So I think renewable energy has a huge tailwind of competitiveness where the margin's actually getting better. So that's one thread. Second thread is also agreeing with what Abe and Don are doing is there is capital available all over the place. Exactly what Abe said. If you're a young entrepreneur and you have an idea, there is money available now. There's angel money, there's early stage money. There's just so many places that you can get your idea off the ground. Climate tech is really having its Netscape moment. There's billions of dollars pouring into decarbonization. We are seeing a Cambrian explosion of exciting activity, and we need a Cambrian explosion of exciting activity. Basically, we need to fund 1,000 different things. We need 1,000 shots on goal to solve this big problem. As Abe said, the energy industry is like the biggest industry on earth. The global GDP is 90 trillion, and the energy industry is 9 trillion. It's 10% of the entire global GDP. So there's just crazy, crazy opportunity, crazy, crazy money available. And if you're someone with an idea, you should go for it because it really is out there. Then you asked me about SPACs. I think SPACs, people might look back at SPACs as one important thing that helps solve climate change, meaning the number of people that have also funded the later stage growth of some of these companies. Again, not all of them will work out, just like every investment thesis. Not every company can succeed. But getting more people to invest in this energy transition and having more capital available, I think is going to end up, when you look back at the end of this decade, as having made a big and positive difference.
Hey, Bill, we have a question from the floor. What is a SPAC? Can you give us a short explanation and maybe just tell us about the couple of SPACs you've done as an illustration?
So a SPAC stands for Special Purpose Acquisition Company. And it's a group of people that form that company and take it public and raise a pool of capital, say $100 or $200 million, and then look for a target of a company to acquire. And they look for an existing company that they can acquire and bring public. And many people have organized SPACs to take high growth climate tech companies public. And it's a way for them to get later stage capital and allow them to really expand, to work their way down the learning curve to be wildly competitive with fossil fuels. And in the last year, several hundred SPACs have occurred, many of them focused around climate-related companies, electrification, electric charging, electric buses, electric cars, and 2 companies of mine as well, Heliogen and Energy Vault, both raised additional capital by using that method of late-stage capital formation. And we're setting out to prove that that is a great way to really make an impact in the climate area.
Now, Bill, it must be said, there have been some dodgy companies that have come out of these SPACs as well. A lot of froth in this, maybe a bit of exuberance, maybe even a bit of backlash now. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely fair. I would say that anyone who is looking to either invest in a SPAC or a company that's going public via SPAC should do as much diligence on any company they would choose to invest in. And I think there was a period last year where maybe people were slacking off on doing that diligence. But I think there's been a pendulum that has swung back to people being very thoughtful about that. So I feel good about that now.
Great. Dawn, did I see that you wanted to come in a little bit earlier?
Yeah, well, I would just second what Bill's saying on the SPAC side in terms of what we're seeing. I'm on the board of a SPAC that's only focused on climate companies. And I think there are still some really amazing high quality companies in this space that would really benefit from being in the public market. And it would be exciting to see other investors be able to participate too. So, I think that makes one of the things in the venture environment that's really important is how do you get your money back? How do you exit? Do you go public? Do you get acquired by another company? And SPACs have added a really legitimate additional way to have these companies grow and have investors get their money back. So it's one of the things that's really supported the early stage venture environment too. So there'll be some correction in the market for sure. We've already seen that over the last few months, but I think it's a good tool in the toolbox as that gets corrected. What I was going to say, as Gary was talking about sort of state and local government, I wanted to just expand on that a little bit. I think one of the questions in the chat is actually kind of what's holding back the speed of solutions now and where we need to go with climate. And I really see state and local government capacity and inertia as one of those critical things that's holding back momentum. And in some ways accelerating momentum when we have the stars aligned. But one of the things that folks in climate really focus on is what's happening at the federal level. What does federal sort of policy look like? Are we going to have a national carbon tax? Are we going to have sort of national clean electricity standards? All of these things are important and would be real accelerants to the market. But what we see specifically with the technologies that we are deploying in Hawaii and California, our companies are working in all 50 states and more than 50 countries, is it's actually the local regulations and the capacity of local government to permit, to approve, to not hold up and create new barriers for new technologies in this space. So we see this in particular, water and wastewater technology, mobility technology, all of these sectors that are actually create the most emissions have some touch point with regulation, have some touch point with infrastructure, with roads, with highways, with water systems, with things that are in the public domain. And so we're thinking about a lot of different ways that we can sort of help unlock that at the local level and build local capacity. But one of the things I think companies and startups and entrepreneurs really actually have to do is lend resources or figure out how to provide resources to supporting that at the local level and building relationships and trust with local stakeholders to get things across the line and show that it can be done and can be repeated over and over. So we can give some examples with how to do that. I guess one quick one would just be our electric airplane company, Ampere, which is, we invested in about half the solution is creating the hybrid electric airplane, which is basically like a Prius flying through the air, right? So that's kind of half the problem or half the challenge is creating that technology. But the other half, when we actually deployed it on Maui, and deployed it in the first commercial route flying this aircraft, was figuring out the local infrastructure, working with the airport authority, working with the utility, working with the local permit agencies and the local unions and the people on the ground, the mechanics, the pilots to make this happen. So that's where we sort of say that, technology can bring half the solution, but the community really, like in reality, brings the other half. Because if you don't have charging, if you don't have permitting, if you don't have all those pieces, you can't fly the airplane.
That's such an interesting example, Dawn, because you're showing systems thinking in that, right? A lot of things get, when you have a narrow focus, if you have a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail to you, right? And so for a long time, the world, capitalism, certainly Anglo-Saxon capitalism, favored very focused companies that did one thing well and was dismissive of conglomerates, let's say, or vertical integration. And what we're seeing, both with models like yours, but also even you can look at Tesla, a for-profit company. They're going upstream to do vertical integration. They're going downstream in ways that were dismissed by some of the business school theorists who favored kind of a pure model. And with climate and some of the complicated areas where public and community and the different pieces come together, the ecosystem is not in place. There may be a role for this coordination role that companies might need to do in partnership with other actors like yourselves, incubators, organizers, nonprofits. So that's a very interesting observation that you make. We have a question about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Abe, do you have enthusiasm to explain briefly what the sort of UN COP methodology is, and maybe how you think about it as an investor?
I don't know about enthusiasm, but I can certainly get into it. I will address that question, but I think that point that you were just making too, I want to pull out a little bit, which is, we tend to think of 3 legs of the stool on innovation, deployment, and policy. They're all supporting our goals, but if we don't have all 3, we're cooked. Don, it was very articulate about getting that out into the community. That's deployment. Historically, venture has been very good at, as you said, kind of that point source solution, and not as good at dealing with the whole kit and caboodle. And certainly on the policy side, both federally as well as locally, terrible. I can't say that we're brilliant at it either. But we do need to understand how and where our companies operate. So innovation is not a solve-all to this problem. Far from it. It is one of the legs of the stool. Scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. I should probably defer to others because I'm going to get the definitions slightly wrong. But the easy heuristic to think about it is scope 1 is what your carbon footprint as an enterprise and what you're directly dealing with. Scope 2 starts to include things like your energy bills and the direct pay, all of the resources that you use directly. Scope 3 gets into full supply chain. So if you think about like the tech companies as a general statement, you might have Apple. Apple's own operations might be their carbon footprint from their flights. It might be from their own ops. When you start thinking about their energy bills and all of those impacts, that's scope 2. But the real piece is that for anybody doing anything in physical world, particularly in manufacturing, most of it's scope 3. It's mostly in the supply chain. And so it gets incredibly complex when you start thinking about, well, what about Apple's supply chain versus Tesla's supply chain versus Microsoft's physical supply chain? Tremendous overlap. And there's this actually a growing industry that is focused on carbon accounting, and people have been talking about this for a long time. So this is nothing new, but they're actually, a lot of these corporate buyers are starting to try to figure this out. And Apple is actually very advanced in this. There's a whole series of startups that are focused on trying to integrate into these corporate systems to actually understand carbon footprint, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Interestingly, in Europe, many of the financial regulators are now pushing, firms who are investing in this space, as in climate, to actually report out on all of their scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 footprints of their investees. And we've giggled a little bit about that internally, because ideally that's wonderful. It's great to think about that. And then you talk about what we do, which is oftentimes investing in 2 people and a dog in a garage, right? They have like no scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 when they start out with. If they're successful, they're going to have a massive impact, and we can't ask them to do a full carbon analysis. And so sometimes the best intentions are still a little confounding when you get into scope 1, scope 2, scope 3.
It's so interesting. Gary, I'm going to come to you because I know you've thought hard about carbon reporting and scope 3 emissions, yes. But I want to share a small anecdote hot off the press. This has really happened this week. And scope 3 emissions, Abe, of course, you're quite right. It's often simplistically seen as not my problem by the companies that are involved. Oil companies are a great example, because sometimes 80 to 90% of the scope 3 emissions involved in the oil industry is me driving my gas guzzler SUV around, for example. And so should BP or Shell be held liable for that? And in Europe, the answer is yes. they are being held liable by investors, by regulators, by lawsuits. In America, the answer is no. A vivid case of this, I was reading the investor transcript for the biggest steel supplier to the US auto industry, a firm in Ohio. And this is the kind of thing I do for fun, right? You know, I'm an economist journalist. We spend weekends reading, you know, analyst reports and transcripts from investor presentations. And he said something astonishing. He said, we're going green. We're investing in, you know, direct reduced iron and trying to green our steel operations. And it sounded pretty good. Like, okay, they're getting on board the green bandwagon. He said, but without getting into all the details, the punchline he said was, if we did this one thing, it would reduce our scope 3 emissions. But we're not going to do that because in America, nobody cares about scope 3 emissions. Nobody even understands it. And so we're going to make this other business choice that's going to reduce our scope 1 and 2 emissions, but probably increase scope 3 emissions. I don't know why that is. It doesn't make sense to me, but that's just how it is. And that's what we're going to do. And I thought, this is really revealing and also very odd for a CEO to say this on an investor call, but almost depressing that this is a state of the world in America, at least, where he felt comfortable saying this as a point of pride to the Wall Street analysts that were listening. So with that, Gary, I know you've worked a little bit on this and put some thought into it. Tell us about your reporting idea.
Yes, your story is so real in my daily life. I'll just say that. A couple things. So when companies are saying that they are carbon zero or will be carbon zero by 2030, 40, 50, they typically mean to say that they're going to be carbon zero, net zero in scope 1s and 2s. It's very rarely that you see in the press event, if you ask the chief sustainability officer, what are you doing around scope 3? Like they actually even have a plan of measuring it, let alone reducing it. So yes, at Reaply, we actually are, with Microsoft and with Tesla, going to be debuting the first carbon calculator in our reuse program to help companies measure and reduce their scope 3 emissions. And quite frankly, the takeaway from that is just reuse. If I buy a couch for my company, that couch now, the carbon that's embodied in that product now falls into scope 3. And if no one's managing it, when I throw it out, when I no longer need it, well, there goes impact that I could have if I were just reusing it. So one of the things that we're helping educate our market and our customer with is like actually reuse actually helps you curb scope 3 emissions, especially what's called the built environment space. So the materials that make up buildings, wood, steel, concrete, plastic, those things are some of the things that we focus on because they are so important. I think something like 11% of greenhouse gas emissions globally come from built environment materials. So really scope 3 is measuring the emissions that aren't, that do not generate from your company, that are scope 1 and 2 emissions from other companies, which means it tends to be the things that you're buying. And because there aren't really carbon calculators in your asset or inventory management systems, people aren't capturing that data. That's what we're doing at Reaply. And it has been actually another thesis to actually learn and speak coherently about that in places like this. So It is complicated.
But it's a powerful tool you're developing. Thank you. I want to get to a couple of questions that are on our list in the short time that we have remaining. There's a question about utility infrastructure. It seems like this lack of smart grids will be a showstopper for meaningful adoption of renewables. What can be done about this? Somebody want to jump in on that, on what would really accelerate the adoption of smart grid technology? And I say this with great heaviness in my heart because I don't know how it'll show up with the weird lighting that I have going on in my office here, but there's a poster for a book I wrote called Power to the People, in which I advocated for smart grids, decentralized, distributed digital solutions as the future of energy. That book was published 20 years ago, and we're still waiting, right? And we're still waiting, right, Bill? So tell me what's going to happen or what needs to happen to really leapfrog ahead and enable the renewables revolution to get to the next level.
We need another senator, and we have to pass Build Back Better.
So federal policy in the US, so climate supportive federal policy.
For something like that, for infrastructure of that scale, it can't be done by an individual company. It's just so big. But we do need it. You're totally right. And you've been writing about it for a long time. I thought we were this close to it. Maybe we will get close to it. Maybe some of the new changes in oil prices will scare people into doing it. I'm not sure, but we definitely need it. You're absolutely right.
Okay, so policy, but we are going to keep hope alive, as it were. Another question asked about the role of existing climate solutions versus future climate solutions. I think it's the classic sort of innovation versus implementation question. Again, John Kerry, the climate envoy for the US, got into trouble a few months ago, and he said, we need innovation to solve the climate problem. And he was immediately denounced by all manner of people who said, no, don't say that. Why? Because if you say innovation, it means you're against implementation or a rollout. That's been one camp of green thinkers have typically taken that view, at least in Washington. What do you folks think? Obviously, I've got a self-selected group of pro-innovation people here, but is there something to the idea that talking about hydrogen and the dream of the future is somehow going to reduce enthusiasm or money for rolling out stuff that we have in hand now? Is that an old debate that's no longer valid, or you think the world is ready to do both with enthusiasm now? Who wants to jump in on that?
I can jump in. I mean, I think that really should be an old debate. There's so much talent in this space now. There's so much capital. People are able to understand that we need innovation and we need deployment. One estimate I saw was that probably about 50% of the technology we need to decarbonize is not yet commercially available. It may have been invented, but it's not yet commercially available at scale. It's, probably there is some truth to that. And all of us really care about innovation, and we think that we can do things much faster and better with innovation. So you're right, it's a bit of a self-selected group, but deployment is absolutely critical. We have to reduce emissions 8% a year. This is completely unprecedented in the history of humankind, and they've still been going up. And we've known about this climate crisis for decades, and emissions are still going up. So we have to deploy as fast as possible. And I wish I could also say that the two things are able to completely happen at the same time. We actually don't really see that at the local government level. We still see distraction from people saying, well, we're going to have this in 10 years, so we're going to wait on this. We're going to wait on implementing 25 megawatts of solar to serve our local government demand because we think we might get this better thing in 5-6 years. So in many, many sectors, I would say in finance, in much of the talent sort of sector, we're seeing people able to do both, say, okay, innovation will serve some needs, let's move as fast as we can in innovation and not hold up deployment. But I will say at some of, especially the local government and state government level, we still are not seeing enough speed because people are hoping there'll be more of a silver bullet. So that's one thing that I would love to change over time.
Vijay, it's very unusual that we have a product. I'm going to say we, in the renewables, we have a product that is actually better and cheaper and should be deployed like crazy and would make people's bills go down. It would actually make people's bills go down if we deploy more of it and make more jobs and everything. And yet and normally that would just get adopted so crazily fast to be ridiculous. But there's this other $1 trillion industry that spends a lot of money convincing people that if you do that, your bill will go up. And it's crazy that people fall for that. But we live in a world of disinformation right now, and people become disbelievers because of that. So we're fighting like doubly, like we're not only fighting to actually make the technology work and beat the price, which we've done, but then fighting this disinformation campaign by these companies that do these greenwashing ads, who are actually just trying to convince you not to go with this other technology that's better. Really, really unbelievable. And they're getting $11 million a minute in subsidies too, 5.9 trillion a year. $11 million every minute they're getting in fossil fuel subsidies. So it's like unbelievable what a barrier we have, but we have to win. We have to fight against that.
So Bill, I think I know the answer to this from you, but I'm going to give each of you in this lightning round. We just have 2 minutes, 30 seconds each. Give me a good, the bad, and the ugly of the future of climate tech. And I'll stick with you, Bill. I'm assuming fossil subsidies are the ugly in your view, but real quick.
So, we already did the ugly. The ugly is the fossil fuel industry is an incumbent that doesn't want to see this succeed because their paycheck depends on it. The good is that companies are taking this seriously, notwithstanding the example you gave of that executive at the steel company who said he didn't want to do that. Look at what Microsoft is doing. Look at what Shopify is doing. Look what Stripe is doing. Microsoft is going to negate
companies are getting serious.
That's they've done in their history. Yeah, it's incredible. So the really, really good is the world cares. The world finally cares, and it's a growing movement. And there's opportunity everywhere. So that's the good.
Okay, Gary, let's come to you. How would you answer the good, the bad, and the ugly?
The good, the talent, the entrepreneurs who are hopefully going to create and foment the innovation. The bad, I would say where we are. It is 2022. My goodness, why aren't we further? And the ugly, I hate to say, will be the transition.
It could be a rough ride. Abe, to you. Good, the bad, and the ugly.
Sure, this is going to be a little redundant. The good is that the world has woken up to our climate challenges and the capital markets are following. That's nothing but good. The bad, read the summary for policymakers of the IPCC report. We need deployment, we need innovation, we need it all. We're not going to make it. We are going to head off some of it. We're not going to head off all of it. And it's an all hands on deck exercise. We will survive. It's going to be messy. And the ugly is watching, the politics result in the lack of policy addressing some of these great challenges.
Dawn, you get the last word.
All right, I would say the good is the folks on this call. We open internships every year, especially for diverse talent in climate tech and first people in their family to go to college. And we've had 2,000 interns apply over the last couple of years for just really a few internships in these spots. There's incredible youth and talent and enthusiasm when people are going to solve this. So please, whatever you're interested in, come into climate. That's the best part. I think the bad, I agree with Abe, not moving fast enough. And the ugly is really similar to what he said, which is that in 2020, think about majority, more than half of the world's displaced people, more than 30 million people were displaced because of climate. And it's estimated to be, more than 200 million people displaced because of climate by 2050. It possibly could be much worse than that. And it's going to be much worse for the most vulnerable among us. So that is going to be a really ugly truth that we're going to have to deal with across humanity.
Well, that's a sobering reminder of why we need to double down on the good. And I hope we've given the audience today both a reason to take it seriously, because it is serious. Indeed, it's the challenge of our lifetimes, of our generation and generations, but also reason to think that you can make that difference, that at last there's traction, there's an opportunity, there's a path, there's money, there's capital, there's seriousness, and people like the ones on this call who've joined us leading the way. So from my end, I say thank you to my wonderful panelists, and thank you to my host, and where I'm delighted to be a fellow this year at the Farley Center. And I turn it back to Hayes to conclude the proceedings.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Vijay. And thanks to the panelists for the work that you're doing and for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. This was a really wonderful, engaging discussion. And I know it's been enjoyed. I can just tell by the level of number of people sending in questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but we got to some of the especially good ones. Thanks to Dean Julio Tino for creating this opportunity for us to come together. Special thanks to the Farley and McCormick teams that helped with this. There are a lot of logistics that go into running a Zoom call even in 2022. Finally, I want to thank all of you who joined us. You are the future. Many of you I know out in the audience are students, and you will be able to be among those to execute on this and really make a difference. So I look forward to seeing what the future Gary Coopers do coming out of Northwestern, and I encourage you all to follow us on our various social media channels, Farley Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. So thank you all, and enjoy your evenings or afternoons, wherever you may be.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks very much.